My slideshow has got two parts. I show a few slides, work under construction and build work from the Architectus studio. And then I thought I'd throw something else in the mix, a different topology that we rarely see in New Zealand. And it's something that I've been involved with at my previous job in Austria a decade ago before I came to New Zealand. And it might offer something for the Auckland market as well. First one here, currently under construction, Vineyard Central in the Vineyard Quarter on Dawley Street. A collection of buildings, a variety of topologies, the 5-story pavilions, 3-story townhouses with a little courtyard, and the 11-story apartment building here with through apartments. A built example here, Trinity in Parnell. You can see the cathedral in the background there. And this is looking at it from Birdwood Crescent. And that building has got two topologies in it. The apartments that we're looking at in this slide here, they're north-facing single aspect ones. And the building is L-shaped. And in the part along Parnell Road, they're through apartments. So they're east-west. And the building has got two faces. It's got one to the public, the glass screen, and a private face to the courtyard with the wooden shutters. And here's a smaller one, Drake Street. You might have noticed that one when you stumble out of La Zeppa late at night. It's directly opposite. It's a sort of small infill mixed use with a retail unit on ground floor, an office on level 1, and 2 apartments on top. And Pip will know this very well because he's put a very nice apartment in there for one of his clients. So this is, we've built a concrete shell with a series of openings in it and then inserted a wooden volume that doesn't quite fill out the shell, so it leaves some spaces which act as courtyards and light wells. And the shell has got these holes so we can get views to the context. Now, back to Austria. So over a decade ago when I had more hair and I was fit enough to cycle to work along Lake Constance here. So this is the city of Bregenz. I was working for Baumschlager Eberle. They've grown from a very small firm to quite a substantial international firm with 8 offices scattered around Europe and Asia. And they've got an extensive housing portfolio. Also to do with Dietmar Eberle's other job as he used to be the dean at DTH in Zurich, the architecture school in Switzerland, where he also heads up the Institute for Housing. So he's got over 20 staff that can do research into every aspect of residential architecture, and obviously the office can benefit from that. And interviewed by Detail magazine in one of their concept issues when they talk about multi-residential, the discussion came about linear topologies, and he's almost talking like a car manufacturer. He says, we've dropped this type, so we're not doing it anymore. Linear block developments are no longer socially acceptable, he says, although we have built schemes with interesting forms of internal circulation that avoid the problem of excess balconies. Excess balcony topologies result in the most uncomfortable form of living due to the disturbance of privacy. So that's his view. And then the interviewer said, well, what else are you doing? What topologies have you got to offer? And one of those is what he calls the point block. And the first example is in the city of Innsbruck, the capital of Tyrol. And for those students who will be going to the Alpine Studio this year, that's directly opposite the technical university. So Innsbruck is a city of about 130,000 citizens. This is on the western fringe. There's a sort of a 60s concrete campus, the technical faculty. The context is quite diverse. And this development here, the first stage, 300 units got built. And this is social housing. The developer is a non-for-profit organization. So we can see that here we've got the figure ground plan here. So that's the part of the university there. And this field here, arranged like a chessboard. It might first look up here a bit arbitrary, but it's been very carefully thought out how this works. So there's a series, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks. They step from 5, 6 up to 7 stories. So north is up the page, but remember the sun is coming from the south in Europe. So the mountains are on the shady side. And this achieves a density of 100 dwellings per hectare. So that's comparable to, that's what Beaumont Quarter is, 100 per hectare. The plan of those is a rectangle. It's got a hole in the middle with a stair and a lift. And then the plan has these zones. So where I put the blue shading around it, that's almost like the core, the service zone. That's where the bathrooms are, that's where the kitchens are, that's where the risers are, that's where all the building services happen. And then you have a series of rooms that they're more or less neutral rooms that wrap around. This one has got 10 apartments per floor. They're primarily east and west facing, where they have their deeper balconies. And to the north and south, the balconies are shallower, so that the houses can be moved closer, or they have more distance between them to get the sun to the ground floor units. And there's some pictures of the public area, the stair. There's a big focus on making that really nice and have a quality arrival, if you like. You know, it's you're living in an apartment. This is the way to your front door, and for everyone that will be coming to visit you. So, in summary, and that's sort of what Deep Maebele says about the point blocks. So, why is he using them? Because they relate to the local context. As you've seen, the landscape, it's quite permeable. They allow multiple views to the nature and connect to the context. Historically, when someone well-to-do had the chance where they lived, they used to live in the West End. It's to do with where the wind comes from and where the factories are and where the smoke blows. So he calls it, it's the sort of West End typology that you find in European cities. Then another very banal fact is that corner apartments always sell out first. So if you do a long sausage, you haven't got many corners, but if you do a lot of those, then you have more corners, so they are desirable, and they, you know, it's just common sense if you follow that logic. Also, longer bars in that sort of suburban landscape, they don't blend in as well because it's more about single houses, and this is just seen as a larger single house. If you size them correctly, there's a sweet spot where the floor area and the facade ratio works out really well, you know, in terms of heating, insulation, sustainability. And you can standardize the facade and just wrap the same detail all the way around. So a lot of these things that come out of a very careful reading of the context. These guys are, although their work is very modern, they're proud to say they're traditionalists. And it's not so much about reading the context and then formally relating to what's there, but uncovering the principles that have shaped the local condition and then, you know, build on that. And the second example that I show, this is a little bit less dense, 76 dwellings per hectare. This is in Switzerland, Axelngut in St. Gallen. And there was a first stage which was all linear, and then when they got involved, they managed to get the master plan changed to a field of point blocks, primarily because this arrangement allowed views to Lake Constance. So this is up on a hillside, this is here, the city is down there, and the lake will be up here on that figure ground plan. So they've all been arranged to get a glimpse of the lake. Very similar, but a little bit different. Again, the stair and the lift in the middle here, we've got larger ones. Obviously, the clientele here is a little bit different. This is not social housing. And they sit on an underground car park, similar to the first example. And when you look at the plan, you may wonder, why do they do this here? Now, in this plan, the sun is here, so east is there and the sun goes around. And as you know, in summer, the sun settles a bit further than west. So that last one here that has primarily morning sun on his balcony gets a little bit of the western sun as well in the evening after work when they come home. So that's why that's there. And on the last slide, just comparing the two facades, Baumschlag-Eberle, they see their work, especially the housing portfolio, not as an area where they can sort of put the architectural mark on it. They see it more as their job to very carefully define the interface between the public realm and the private space based on a social consensus, how that should happen. Other reasons, because the facade is very important in their work, has to do with sustainability, shading, insulation, the layering, and prefabrication as well. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Severin. So our next speaker is Pip. Don't sit down, Pip. Stand up.
That's right.
So Pip Cheshire from Cheshire Architects.
Thank you. That's beautiful work. And lovely to see that Drake Street building, which I think is a really smart building to look at. The idea of a hard shell carapace around the outside and then a sort of smaller timber structure is very beautiful. It creates two light shafts down through the project. It's very good. Okay, I just want to talk first of all about this building, which is what we call Sky. So it's the old Windstone building, Khyber Pass along here, Simon's along here. This has been demolished and an apartment building built here. A really benign project from our point of view. A great building on a ripper of a site because it has a little street coming through here called Hoaperi Street and Khyber Pass here. So the site links through. You can actually drive down here, down a private road and then back up and out here. And so we're really interested in how this might make a contribution to the way that that area might be developed. The building sits up against Mount Eden, and I believe it was actually designed to be about way up here, but the architects and students of the city rebelled, and the opposition to that gave rise to the volcanic sightline, protection sightlines in Auckland, and this was lopped down. But whatever it meant for us, that we had these sightlines coming through here that limited the height of development possible on the site. We made an argument that the tower, in essence, occluded the view of Mount Eden from the origin. The origin is just as you approach the harbour bridge. And so we argued that buildings behind, within the shadow, could be a wee bit higher, but along here we were constrained by both the volcanic sightline and the underlying planning. This is an early construction photograph from 1960s, and when we got the original construction drawings, we saw this rather robust structure, and one of the things that was really fortuitous was this floor plate cantilevering out. And it cantilevers out about 605 millimetres, which gave us 5 millimetres of clearance from fire rigs, floor-to-floor fire rigs, and so it allowed us to glaze up and glaze down. And so we set to, I'm sorry if I'm drifting away, we set to and thought about reconfiguring this, and the words of John Goldwater, one of my teachers, sounded in my ears that if you put in terraces, you had to put them integrally inside of the building so that the QS can't lop them off. And so we took this at his word and developed that. And so one of the things that's interesting is that you get a kind of stratification, and between this thing up here, which looks right down pretty much 360 degrees over the isthmus, and you have sort of uninterrupted views down to about this level here, and then what we're not showing is a building on the north side coming up to about this height and occluding some of the view. And this is some marketing stuff. You can see how we've pulled away the downstanding sunshades in favour of some more high-tech glass, and then the glazing down to the floor level. But I talked about the precinct, or the site as a whole. Hoa Perry Street, Simon's down here, Newton here, and Kaiba Pass. The ability to link through here. The original building had this tower here, which I've been illustrating, and then some low-rise stuff here, which I thought was really interesting low-rise. It had those little pyramidal roofs, and it had a bar and hotel and all that kind of stuff, as well as commercial premises and shops. But a really weird ground plane that stepped down a whole level from Kaiba Pass to the bottom of the tower, and as you step down, the beams were quite low. We tried like fury to work with the existing buildings, but just too hard. But it seemed to us there was an opportunity here of developing some links through the site that would offer something more complex kind of engagement in the site than just the tower by itself. And so the plan generated into some lower rise buildings here. This one here, remember, we can sit within the shadow of the tower, so it's a wee bit taller, and then a little freestanding job. And then we flattened out the ground plane out here and created some car parking underneath that. And this is pretty much how it goes. The tower here, Hoa Perry Street coming in from here. This is the building on the north side I talked about that includes the views for about the lower 3 or 4 stories. And the Cité building. So our site is, it's a curious building. It's got car parking here, but that's a subfloor. And pretty much how it is now, the idea of a kind of green, leafy retreat in here with from the sort of very noisy traffic on either sides. I was very taken with the idea of a very loose landscape that would be a foil to these constructed things, a more robust tower, and this is Berlimar's projects, and so they informed our instructions to the landscape man, and this is an earlier kind of render of the link through from Hoa Perry Street up some stairs to the upper level, and then the entry to the tower. And then from Kaiba Pass, the idea of glimpsing something through there, a little garden, a bit of light and activity. Commercial space hard on Kaiba Pass, and retail, commercial down below, and then residential up above. The presence of this building on the north side here has implied a kind of social structure through the building, and as I said, it's very benign. I'd love to think that we had generated that, or the developer had, but actually the site conditions determine it. That here you have these exquisite views over, as I said, the whole isthmus pretty much. When you get down to about here, your view is increasingly occluded by this building, and so there's a kind of stratification from the sort of multi-million-dollar penthouse up here to my son, the tattooist, living down here. And so you get that whole structuring through there. And then you see the sort of stepping ground plane here. Sorry, I'm just acutely aware of timing here. Okay, I'll move a bit faster. The inward terraces here, you cannot demolish those without demolishing the structure. And on the lower levels, we were quite interested in a kind of warehouse aesthetic. So these are, this is a plan, typical plan for the lower floor where there is no great outlook out here. There's about a 10-metre gap to the adjacent building. And we considered these as just large rectangular spaces. They have some opening bifolding windows here, and then a plywood box that sits in here, the kind of necessary room inside of this. And given the geometry of the tower, these things are moving around a wee bit. Mostly they're floating in the middle, but some are against the wall and so forth. And these little boxes, plywood boxes with a laundry and bathroom, and then kitchen backing onto that. And a pretty simple thing, the service pipes are all exposed, the roof structure's exposed. The lower floor's got a concrete slab, upper story got timber floating over the top. And they can be fitted out to be pretty flash, but the you know, the pipes and services are exposed. Another strategy is in Parnell, another project to me, an old car assembly building with a hellish geometry and a hellish construction, really. But a similar sort of strategy of embracing that sort of raw industrial aesthetic and nibbling away into it. Here, very few place opportunities for outlook, and so nibbling in courtyards in here, and so sort of courtyards in here, but bounded by solid walls, and quite a rugged internal circulation route, but just leading into very simple, open, rectangular spaces, and livening those with some jewels on the inside. You see the outdoor courtyard here, some nice joinery installed, and then always the kind of strategy of paring back the building to as little building as we possibly can do, and then putting some jewels of occupation and contact. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Pip. And our third speaker is Tomasz Gibowicz from Jasmax, who will also be talking about turning a commercial building into a residential.
Yes, so the sequencing works quite well after Pip's. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tomasz, and I work at the residential studio at Jasmax. I'm a big fan of adaptive reuse, so today I'd like to focus only on one project and briefly touch on three subjects, and hopefully there'll be a little bit more time afterwards to have a conversation about them. The building is the ex-Frontier headquarters just down the road on Princess Street. That's been converted into apartments. One of the first things that I think we need to have a look at is the positives and the negatives, or the challenges and the opportunities of working with an existing fabric. So I'll start with the negatives, so that we'll leave with the positives. One of the difficulties with a commercial building is that it usually has a deep floor plate, and when you're converting it to apartments, that creates a problem with a light fall off. The acoustics is much more demanding for apartments than it is for commercial buildings. So is fire regulations. We've got the existing structure that's setting somewhat the limits to as to how much more dead weight the building can take on top. In our case, we managed to put 3 extra floors on top without upsetting the structure engineer. And then the existing buildings all come with bags of surprises. So it's just a matter of preempting those and being ready for them and programming accordingly, I suppose, which doesn't always happen, unfortunately. But hey, they're not all dark sides. There's obviously positives, and I'm really big advocate of rejuvenation. So for once, it ticks all the boxes for urban rejuvenation. So that's a no-brainer. Usually we've got great location, again, good linkage to public transport, public amenities, so those are relatively easy as well. The commercial buildings typically have quite high floor-to-ceiling height, so that translates directly into volume, and volume really is key in the apartment. So it really makes a big difference, even for the smaller apartments. Every building comes with a bit of history. Doesn't have to be heritage, but there's a story or two about every building, so that also sets its presence in the urban fabric, and we can drill on that. I'm realizing I'm barely scratching the surface here, so hopefully we can expand that a little bit more. The second area I'd like to touch on is balconies. When we were thinking about what is the best way to use a balcony, how can we maximize the use of a balcony, and the idea of an enclosed balcony is not new. It's not mine anyway. So we thought it's quite a good typology to explore, and I would never have thought, I mean, at least then, I believe that no one in their right mind would ever design a triangular room. But there you have it. This is the existing Frontiera's building is octagonal in its shape, so when we squared it off, as you do, we ended up with a relatively big space in the corners, and big enough almost to make it a separate room. So the idea was to make the most of the sunny day, opening the both sides of the corner, 6-meter openings, double slided, sliding both ways, and on a less favorable day or part of the day, rain, a bit of wind. These look more like mosquitoes on the side, but the balcony becomes part of their living space. So that was the concept. An artist's impression of what it might look like with a chair and a rug. The same logic was applied to the smaller bedrooms. So essentially, it extends the bedroom, allows for it to be a bit of a study space. You can hang your back there if you want to, but essentially, it's just adding that additional space that you can use 365 days a year. And enough on the balconies. The third subject I'd like to touch on is the open question about creating opportunities for residents to build neighbour relationships, and it's something that I'm really interested in. How do we do that? What are the tools that we can give the residents in the buildings? In the International, almost the entire floor plate at the Princess Street level, except from the top there, which is the commercial space, is designated for residents' amenities, and you've got quite a variety. Most of them are exclusively for residents' access. A media room, a private dining, or a bit of a flexible event space, a library, a pool, and what have you. But then we've also got this space here that's designed at this stage as a cafe, possibly even a bar, that allows public to get into the building and inject a little bit more life into that ground plane. Public can, during the day, can meander through here and then through the cafe out and down onto Bankside Street, which currently is a bit of a forgotten place in the city. Although there's a really nice heritage cottage at the back, which seems to be the oldest residential building in the CBD that anyone knows about. This could be a place where you could have could watch a game with your friends and hopefully neighbours as well, without waking up the rest of your family. This is the flexible space, currently named as the private dining, but it allows the residents to have slightly bigger events here, overlooking the city, and what the library might look like in a few years' time when the trees grow big enough. So I realized that the International sits on one side of the spectrum with its price tag attached and so forth. And I think we as architects, designers, urban designers, we have a bit of a role to play to fill the entire spectrum and provide those tools for growing communities, building neighborhood relationships, even for those more affordable apartment buildings. And I think to do that, we just need to give the residents space outside of their private apartment. And secondly, we need to provide them with enough flexibility, give them enough ownership of that space, so that throughout their life in the building, they can tweak it, they can transform it into something that will become a bit of an identity of that community. Yeah, thank you.
And our final speaker is Tim Melville from Warren and Mahoney. Thank you.
And as I say, now for something completely different from the three previous speakers, really, in terms of our context. This is essentially a tale of two suburban apartment buildings in Stonefields in the eastern suburbs. So for those who aren't familiar with Stonefields, there's an aerial on the left here The blue indicates Altera, which is the first building that I will be talking about. Just to give a bit of context, in the bottom right-hand corner is Mount Wellington, and the top left-hand corner is Remuera Golf Course, and in the top right-hand corner is the Auckland Netball Centre. Essentially, Stonefields started development, I think, 15 or 16 years ago with a master plan, and the first housing that was developed there was terraced housing and standalone dwellings. This building, Altera, was the second apartment building to be developed there. The first one you can see in the right-hand photo is under construction in that photo in the background. This is showing our site for the Altera apartment development. This was the brief essentially was medium high-end apartments, mix of 2 and 3 beds, 2 car parks per apartment, and visitor parking required on-site, and of course maximising the yield. So vehicles, probably one of the most difficult design constraints that we all face in all types of housing, but particularly in the suburban context and the expectation of the purchasers. So trying to get 2 car parks per apartment on this site plus visitor parking, there was no choice but to go into the basement, and most of us know that basement construction is rather expensive. So essentially you can see on the right hand side there the basement, 75 car parking spaces down there, a small gym for the residents in the right hand corner, and we had storage lockers for the residents down at that level. Above that, the podium where we have the apartments and some limited podium parking, we have 14 resident car parks and 7 visitor car parks. We were very lucky in a way that we have access from Brian Slater Way, which is in that top left-hand corner, which allowed us to get the vehicles in and out from there without interfering with the main frontages on Blue Grey Ave and College Road. I think, as we'll see, it's really very significant that this site, along with the existing building over the road, Saltus, essentially are at one of the 2 main roads into Stonefield. So it's quite a prominent site, and we'll look at the urban design principles that we applied shortly. So this was a significant constraint, obviously, and one that when we look at Illico, the second apartment building, which is a lower cost apartment building, we'll see what the implications were on that side as well. So the circulation strategy, interesting hearing our first speaker talk about perhaps what we can't do or shouldn't do in terms of long buildings. Sometimes the context that we're designing in prevents us from necessarily breaking buildings up. There's a lot of things that come into play, and it's one thing to be on a greenfield site and planning out the ideal apartment building. It's another thing being on a commercial site in a new subdivision in Auckland City trying to get lots of cars and lots of amenity. And so the circulation strategy that we set on for this project and worked through with our client was a distributed core model. So essentially there's a lift and a stair for every 2 apartments on each floor, except in the corner where there's 3, one being accessed via a bridge. So essentially this circulation strategy helps us, and someone was talking earlier on about sense of community, and talking with some of the owners of these apartments since they've moved in, they've reinforced the fact that having this distributed core model helps them get to know their more immediate neighbours a lot more, and given that a lot of the people who bought these apartments were empty nesters who were semi-retired or heading towards retirement and were moving out of large family homes that they'd lived in all their lives with their children, it's quite significant, this issue of community for them, and they felt that this was helping them and meeting the people they lived with and establishing that sense of community. The other thing that the distributed core model allows us to do is essentially to have a dual aspect apartment, which we will talk about in a minute. It's the next slide. But the other significant thing in urban design terms is having multiple street addresses rather than one. And in addition to that, not shown on this drawing, is a main pedestrian entry to the podium there as well. So essentially that was the circulation strategy. This is looking at the apartment typology. It's a dual aspect typology facilitated by that distributed core. Essentially a very, very simple plan. It's got a high level of amenity for and usability for its size. This plan allows maximum natural light and natural ventilation, including cross ventilation through the apartment. And particularly that cross ventilation thing is quite an important thing in Auckland, as we know, in February and March, this time of year. The living spaces, as we're showing here on the right, for all the apartments are either facing north, east or northwest. And then the bedrooms face onto College Road and onto Blue Grey Ave. One of the things that I'll touch on very, very quickly that we have to deal with in these situations is the acoustics. Some of the previous speakers have touched on that too. Having bedrooms on streets means that we needed to provide a passive mechanical ventilation system so that they could have air and keep their windows closed so they weren't disturbed by the traffic. So there's a whole lot of subtleties that go there. But we get the preservation of the view through the apartment, and you'll see in some images later on how significant that is, but it does help accentuate the sense of spaciousness that you can see the distance from various parts of the apartment. Essentially, we've got a very efficient service pod in the middle which separates the living spaces from the bedrooms, very efficient vertical services, minimal interior partitions, and quite an economic way of building these apartments. Well, where am I going? So, in terms of urban design, you can imagine that as the second apartment building in Stonefields, building of height, that these issues of urban design are very sensitive, both with council but also with the residents. So the approach we took, and you can see from these renders here, hopefully illustrate this, essentially the building forms a gateway to the Stonefields, the suburb of Stonefields, with the Salters building across the road. We've worked very hard to address that corner on the modulation of the facade, and that's both vertically and horizontally, getting rhythms into the facade. The distributed core circulation, as we looked at previously, allows us to have those multiple street entries, which is actually a really significant thing for the development, that people are coming in from various parts rather than through one single entry. And then the scale in relationship to the neighbours. So you'll see in the bottom right image, the neighbour on College Road is a two-storey house. So essentially we've stepped the building down to acknowledge the scale of that. As the building goes round the corner into Blue Grey Ave, the next site along is another apartment building that we've just recently completed there, which is the same scale. So essentially that gets some continuity down Blue Grey Ave. Just some photos here, top left, evening shot, bottom left, photo of the corner completed, and then just some detail of some of the facade. That's the bedroom elevations along Blue Grey Ave, and some interior render shots, essentially just showing the interiors, and I think the top right one demonstrates quite well that connectivity and that view through. That's quite a feature of them. The other two are showing courtyards. It's obviously ground floor apartments. The upper floor apartments have quite generous balconies also, but at the ground levels are particularly good in that they have the courtyard off the living space, but also they have a small courtyard off the bedrooms as well. So the challenge was next to translate these design principles and this urban design strategy into an apartments for purchasers with a limited budget. And this is the thing that's confronting this city and this country right now, as we all know. Site shown in purple up there, it's beside the Soltis apartment building under construction there. You can see in the right-hand photo. The brief was entry-level affordable apartments starting at that time in 2013 when they went to market at $350,000. That doesn't happen anymore, as we know. So, you know, getting the cost of this building down so that those apartments were able to be, you know, sold and have a profit made at that level was a real challenge, as some of my colleagues who are here will recall. Once again, a mix of 1 and 2 bedrooms, 1 car park per apartment, plus on-site visitor car parking, no basement car parking, cannot afford it. So, the next slide, what does that mean? What's the challenge there? That means we've got to get 66 resident parks and 12 visitor parks on grade. Very difficult thing to do. Urban design terms, a difficult thing to do. We broke the 2 in half in terms of the vehicle access from the street, and then broke them into 3 again, and have landscaping that breaks up the car park just to try and reduce the scale and the impact. In terms of circulation strategy, unable to afford a distributed core model for this project because of the cost. We had essentially, when we started this project, we were given some sketch plans that had been done previously of a different typology for this project, and told that that wasn't affordable, and it had 4 stairs and 4 lifts, so do better. So we did. The key point here is that this is a standoff breezeway, or boardwalk as it might be known, but the key aspect is that it's more than 3 metres off the face of the building, and it has bridges to the apartments. So it's allowed us essentially to maintain the dual aspect typology plan, which is critical for the natural ventilation, natural light, and the usability for the owners. There's significant screening for visual privacy, both onto the car park so neighbours can't see in, but also where there are stairs there. And the bridges do encourage some resident interaction. Most of the bridges have got 2 apartments off them, so you bump into your neighbour and say good day. So, you know, those things are still happening there. Going into the apartment plan itself, this is a 2-bedroom. We're able to keep that dual aspect typology, same things, high level of amenity, natural light, ventilation, and preserving views through the apartments, and an efficient services pod, all there. Urban design terms, the bottom image shows the continuity of scale and form from the Soltis apartment building up the street, and then we're on a corner into another street at the other end. So maintaining that street edge and scale, addressing the corner, adjacent residential, once again modulation of facade to break up the length of this long building, which we heard is not desirable, but sometimes not avoidable. And the balconies and elevated boardwalks, they're breaking down this building mass and making it seem like it's not one long building. The other urban design response is that we've got courtyard access to the courtyards of the ground floor apartments, so they're able to access from the street. Just some photos of this on the left, the boardwalk or standoff breezeway and screens. Middle is the balconies on the blue-grey side, and you can see the variation and modulation that's happening there. And on the right just shows the bridges from the standoff breezeway to the apartments. I think probably the bottom image here really just is very good at explaining the benefits of this dual aspect typology. We've got the boardwalk, standoff breezeway on the left, bridge, natural light, ventilation into the apartment, heading right, balconies out to the sun and the views. Pretty much summarises what we were trying to achieve with this apartment design. So what next? We are now using a lot of this design thinking and developing it further in social housing. We're doing apartment buildings for Housing New Zealand at the moment, and we're endeavouring to use these learnings and ideas from the commercial market in social housing where it's so critical. Just to finish, I would like to acknowledge the people I work with at Warren and Mahoney, some of whom are here tonight. An outstanding group of people, dedicated people who made this all happen and continue to do so. And a little shout out to Matt and to Joe for helping me with this presentation. Not easy to explain all your design ideas that the team's come up with in 7 minutes. Over and out. Thanks, guys.
If we just, we'll just invite our speakers to come up and take a seat at the table, and we'll leave you with one microphone. And what we'll do is get straight into the discussion. So who's got a burning question or a comment that they'd like to address to the designer?
Just like to ask Tim if he's got any figures on the density of those apartments, and also comparing that to the density of the housing that surrounds them.
I don't have actual density figures here. I'm sorry, Barry, but I do have some square metre, some gross floor areas. You can see that that obviously we're denser on the Altera apartment building because of the basement car parking, and the density's a lot less on Ellico.
Yeah, I think what I was sort of thinking of highlighting was the elephant in the room is that you've got those two beautiful buildings in the sea of pretty cruddy old developers' housing, and you know that is the challenge to our profession, isn't it? Really.
I think it like any new to be fair, I suppose, like any new suburb that's ever been created, until the landscaping and the greenery starts to grow up a bit, it looks, you know, a little bit dismal. And particularly when you look at it from Mount Wellington and it's just a sea of grey roofs, it's not a pretty sight. What's been really interesting about working out there and doing these apartment buildings, you know, those terrace houses out there cost over $1 million now, and the people who were looking to buy those are buying apartments, you know, and you know, despite what we hear from the media and despite what we hear from politicians that New Zealanders and Aucklanders won't get into apartments, they are, and it's not. It is young people, but it's also older people who are embracing that lifestyle. So it's really interesting to see that change out there. But I know what you're saying about what's already there, but hopefully we're helping make that a bit better.
Thanks, Tim. Another question for Tim or another member of the panel?
Hi, I've got a question for the gentleman who's worked in Austria. I think I caught in a town of a population of 120,000 people, you were doing the point buildings. In Innsbruck, 100 dwellings per hectare, the same density as we're proposing on our waterfront and Wynyard Corner for a town in the beautiful countryside of a population of 120,000 people, which is like, I don't know, Te Awamutu or something like that, you know. So my question is, why is it that people in Austria that live in a small town in a beautiful environment are all prepared to go and live in a medium density situation when all the people that live in our surrounding suburbs in equally beautiful environment are reluctant to live in that level of density? Why is that?
Well, I think
10 seconds or less.
This is probably pretty easy to answer, because Austria is a much smaller country. We haven't got that much land that can be developed, because a lot of it is forests and mountains where you wouldn't want to build or you can't build. You know, there's if you look at the zoning plan, there's a lot of red, where avalanches are coming down, or there's overland flow path and land slips. So, but also it's a very old country, and Innsbruck is a very old city that goes a long way back. And the core of Innsbruck, the old town, used to be inside the wall, is actually much denser, right? So, like when Pip said, the ground floor apartment hasn't got much outlook because there's 10 meters. Well, in the old town of Innsbruck, there's less than that. Some of the lanes are so narrow you can't get two cars past each other, and it's all been pedestrianized. So, it's what people know and how they have grown up. I mean, how many people in New Zealand, have been born into an apartment building? It's not in the genes, and there's and if so, like, what's the percentage of those people that have been growing up in a good apartment building? Well, it gets even smaller. So of course there's a reluctance. No one wants that because you haven't had good examples and you've not been used to it. So. And in Austria, the zoning, we have to be very careful with the way the city grows, of course there's more land. This is out by the airport. This is on the western fringe, but there's a lot of thinking ahead, and the projections and how Innsbruck will, it's the same as the unitary plan or the Auckland plan. We know what we want to be doing in the next 40 years. So if you compare this to Stonefields, and I don't know that much about the master plan, but if you look at it, where's the train and how can you get there and how close it is to Auckland, to the center, well, how does the master plan for new development, how do we pitch this? Maybe at the time, terrace housing and townhouses seemed already quite a change, from single-family houses, but obviously now the land value, you got to build apartments there, and you can sell them. So, have we got this right? And the question is, what are we going to do next? I think that it's, for example, if you look at Long Bay, so Auckland is just growing, like in Auckland used to stop there. You drive down to the beach, to the reserve, and Torbay, and you just look at the land there, and that's just where it stopped. And now it's full of houses, but it's just sort of more of the same, right? And if you look at that example in Switzerland, which, I'd happily live there in one of those apartments, which seems very permeable, and we've got a density of 76 dwellings per hectare. Well, I don't know what we're achieving in Long Bay. That's probably 30 or something. So, yeah.
Do we have another question at the back?
Yeah, thank you all. I was really interested that you focused so heavily on apartments, and my question was, in your practices, where do you draw the line between the concept of medium density versus high density?
I try to answer that one, because it's not probably not an easy one. I didn't know the term medium density until a few weeks ago. The reality is, I googled it, and it seems to be an Australian term for intensifying suburbs. What I know from Europe, from Poland, where I was born, and from where I lived for a long time, it was either the suburbs and the houses or apartments, which is relatively high density. And I think it doesn't really matter whether it's 20, whether it's 80, whether it's 120 dwellings per hectare. What matters is the building or the buildings, is the neighborhood working? And I think that, just to expand on what you said, I think the transformation is happening faster than we led to believe. When I came to New Zealand a few years ago, I heard everywhere, just be careful, the apartments, they're not really very well respected here. And then, before you know it, everyone's talking about apartments. And I think the problem now is it goes even further. There are now groups of people, big groups of people, that throughout their life might not even be able to afford an apartment. So the next question is, how do we accommodate those people who will be renting for a long term? And at the moment, the average rent is about a year. It does not inspire building communities. What can we do to promote long tenure, 7 years and 10 years, so that people can customize their apartments, can make them homes, not just apartments that they move from one to another? Yeah.
Just perhaps in terms of differentiating, I think we would see medium density housing being terrace housing, 2 to 3 story walk-ups, through to the apartment buildings of the scale that we were looking at there. And particularly, I suppose, because the unitary plan, in terms of its densification, is generally looking at 5 or 6 stories along arterial routes, and in certain town centres, obviously it goes up. And I suppose we would see high-density apartment living as being more like a couple of the projects we saw there with, 12, 15, 18, 20-storey buildings, where you're getting a lot more density. You're getting a lot more people on that small piece of land. So that's roughly how we're probably thinking about it at the moment.
I'm keen to get a comment from Pip on something, because the siren call of Rufus Wainwright will be luring him away shortly.
I'm not sure I'm going to talk about medium and high density. I'm not sure the relevance of the question for us. As I said, we were given a very finite set of controls and jammed as many people in there as we could. So I'm sorry, that's not much of an answer.
One here.
I just found it interesting looking at the examples in Europe, where there was quite very, very dense apartments in those point blocks, but there was equally a lot of space given over to the exterior, whereas a dense example in Stonefields, where actually I think the lift capacity was probably about double, and the stair capacity, but very little exterior space, and it was all given over to car parks, obviously. I mean, was there any consideration given to putting a deck over top of the car parks? Yeah.
Essentially, at the end of the day, it came down to, in terms of the Illico apartment building, it came down to cost. I mean, we've really got to get that in context. You tell me where you would see a $350,000 apartment for sale now, and you won't find one, I don't think, unless they're one of these tiny little things in the CBD, perhaps. So those apartments obviously are worth more than that now. But essentially they were aiming for that market. And I think something that's really important to appreciate is that building and the subsequent Verto building, which has just been completed over the road, which are the affordable apartment buildings at Stonefields, have sold like hotcakes. They have been out the door, and unfortunately for us all, a good chunk of that's speculators and investors, but it's also first home buyers, and it's people who see the opportunity to actually own an apartment when perhaps, say, didn't think they could. So to achieve that, we have to keep the costs as low as possible. And yes, we're working for developers, but they're in the job of making money out of their business like everybody else is, including architects. I think the problem is, and this is a personal feeling, is it's the bloody cars. When we were having a meeting with Stonefields residents about a subsequent apartment building and the resource consent that was being applied for that, the biggest problem that the Stonefields residents have about tall buildings is that there's more people and there's more cars on the road and less parking, right? So we're at this evening, and this gentleman who'd had a few glasses of wine before he came along to the evening started saying to me and my colleague Patrick, oh, well, you know, this parking thing, that's a real pain, you know. I'm sitting there in my terraced house and, you know, me and my wife, we've got a car, and then, you know, the 3 kids are grown up and they've all got a car, and, you know, so we've got nowhere to bloody park. And their double garage was full of crap, so they didn't park any cars in their garage. And, you know, I mean, if everybody in Stonefields has got 5 cars, really, so I actually don't think, I mean, in answer to your question, budget, cost, making these things affordable, but my big thing for us all is to stop building bloody car parks and prioritise human beings over their bloody cars. But that's wishful thinking, I think. But
Well, prematurely thank
Thank you all for coming. It's very encouraging to see so much interest in really critical issue. Sorry about that, everyone.
Is there a consensus on how big Auckland, the population of Auckland, is going to get? That is to say, how prepared do we have to be?
I think the problem now is that we're not even talking about getting prepared. We're talking about catching up, and that's a major problem. The influx of people and the deficit of apartments or living space is enormous at the moment, and whether they're townhouses, whether they're apartments, whether they're rental property, there's still not enough, and that's driving the cost or the purchase price up, and it's driving the rental cost up. So it's and just when you mentioned that it's wishful thinking, I think there are a few models in Australia, the Nightingale model and the Commons by Breathe Architects in Melbourne, when they fought really hard with the council to remove the car parking. And one of them I don't think got built just yet. The other one did, and everyone seems to be okay with that. They're carpooling. The sense of community is even bigger, probably because of that as well. But yeah, I think it can be done. It doesn't happen overnight, but yeah, there's hope.
I think of the way the figures are looking at the moment, obviously the migration, and everybody wants to talk about immigration, but it's migration, whether it's from overseas or other parts of New Zealand, is huge. And so I would say that the city is going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. If it's anything like any other Western country in the world, there's one big city that's bigger than all the rest, and this is it. So that's what I'd anticipate. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to sort of quickly touch on in terms of what you were saying about the future and about cars and what have you, is that Ockham, who I think they've got a presentation in this series, they've got a building that they've done in Eden Terrace there that doesn't have any car parking for their residents, and I think they've got an electric car that the residents can book in, or 2 of them, and they can share, and so hopefully those sorts of things start to happen more and more. It's a different context in a suburban situation like Stonefields. I think the other thing that we're already, and I'm sure we're all thinking about, is driverless cars in the future, electric cars, the need. Will everybody own a car? Will everybody want to own a car? Hopefully the answer is no, and then we can start prioritising people even more over vehicles. That's my hope.
Hi, Nico from Generation Zero. Just wanted to ask, who do you think should drive the next 100,000 houses in Auckland? Do you think it should be the government, or something like the Hobsonville strategy kind of scaled up, or maybe more council involvement? Do you want to touch on that issue?
I mean, I think we all hopefully can see that the Hobsonville model has been a significant success in a lot of ways, and I think someone touched on it earlier on. I mean, at the beginning of that is good master planning and good urban design, and that's the beginnings of creating communities, as we know. It's a little bit hard to know what the answer is to your question, really. I personally think that the government and through vehicles, not just Housing New Zealand, but also like the Hobsonville Land Company, have to be involved. And I think one of the things that I didn't talk about, and we haven't really talked about in our presentations, is about construction costs, which are, as we all know, crazy. What I believe, and I've been talking with others, and not just in our profession, but within the industry about, is we need to innovate in terms of the way we build buildings. But at the top of the market where we are at the moment, it's very difficult to get our contractors to actually change their way of working. And our two buildings there are a classic example. 4, 5, 6, 7-storey buildings in this country, we have traditionally built them the same way we build a 35-storey building. They're concrete column and beams. We put precast concrete on the outside. And it's not a cost-effective way of building buildings at that scale. It gets cost-effective as you go higher, but not for those scale buildings. So that's one of the problems we've got. But if we want to do something about that, I believe we need the government to be setting the scene for cross-laminated timber, alternative building technologies, and sharing some of the risk, rather than just saying to the private sector, you guys take the risk, hope it works, guys, see you later. I just don't think that will work. Why would any of the developers that we would work with say, when they say, has that been done in New Zealand before, and we go, oh no, but it's been done overseas, and they turn around and say, well, why should we take the risk? And it's sort of, they've got a point, you know? So I think the government's got a big role to play and through various vehicles and helping us get better, because we need to.
Well, maybe just a few facts on that Innsbruck example that I showed first, the one with the point blocks by the university out there. Now, as I said, it's social housing, and the developer is a non-for-profit organization, and they take a long-term interest because they'll be owning this over many years. So what's important for them is that this lasts and it's durable and the maintenance costs are low. So when they looked at it, obviously they have to realize this for a cost that is not higher than what the average construction cost for comparable building will be. So by having, getting the basics right, getting the surface area of the facade right to the floor plan, so they are roughly 34 by 24 meters rectangles. That's how deep they are. And by standardizing the facade, there's a lot of off-site manufacture that can happen, and I mean, it's got the luxury. It sits on an underground car park. The competition scheme was one large car park that linked all the 6 blocks together. And they looked at it again, and then actually it was found to be cheaper to concentrate the car park in the center and make it 2-story, and then just have little corridors going off to the lifts that go down to the underground car park. I mean, the structure is all. We do in Austria. The precast industry is not that developed as in New Zealand. It's mostly in situ, so it's concrete columns and flat slabs. But the building is also very sustainable. It's insulated above code. You would have seen the roofs are full of solar panels, and they're exchanging the heat. There's a heat exchanger in the roof. But what also happens is they have a forced ventilation system. So when it goes colder than 10 degrees on the outside, then the residents can start heating. And there's ducts that run in the concrete slab, and there's a very small heat pump that can be switched on to assist that, and then they force the warm air into the various rooms. So the envelope is actually quite airtight, and all this new stuff. Obviously, this is 15 years old now. So at the time when this started, this was new overseas as well. This technology, and there's always problems, with your tenants, and you have to educate them. So what was done at the time, the sort of a manual was put together how to live in this, and they produced. They still have VHS video players at home, so we were given a video cassette that showed you how to operate this, how to turn the ventilation on, how to do this correctly. Because if you've got such an airtight facade, and you don't turn this on, then you haven't got the air change that you need, and then the humidity goes up because people hang up washing in the living room, and then you get mold, and so there's an educational thing that goes with that. But the housing provider is really hands-on, and they go back and they do post-occupancy evaluation, and there's a lot of intelligence, and they're building up knowledge. And the practice that I worked at, they've done so much, and in terms of housing, and they don't always start something new in the office. What they do is they fine-tune. Next time, okay, like when you do the next and the next, you've got your topologies, and you make it better. You can do it more efficient, and they have been lucky, but there's certain contractors they've worked with 50 times, and they use the same structural engineers, or they know the people. Every time they do it, it gets better, it gets easier, and you can do a little bit more, because you don't have to overcome the first hurdles that you already solved in the last time. So quite fortunate in that respect.
We've probably got time for one last question. The hand has gone up at the back.
So I see great examples here of tremendous work that you guys have put up, but my concern is that, as we're all aware, the sector of our community here in Auckland who are most desperately in need of housing are the Pacific and Māori community. And I can see affordability issues with the work that you're putting up, the cost. Not only that, the sizes of the apartments that you are working on, most Pacific and Māori families would be, a 2-bedroom apartment would just be not suitable at all. So I don't really know if there's an answer to my question, but it's actually quite appropriate that the slide that's up there now is to do with social housing. And I think you did comment that you were applying some of those ideas that you're now working on to social housing. But it does worry me because even though I really like what I'm seeing here, I cannot put the two together. How does this work for that sector of our Auckland community who are in most need of housing? Really, that was the point I just wanted to make.
Any response to that?
I think we're obviously working with Housing New Zealand, and I won't go into the detail of the projects we're doing with them, but they are apartment buildings, so it is, as you can see up there, they're reasonably dense developments, and they are for a range of sizes. From two of the buildings we're working on are only 1 bedrooms for the whole apartment complex, and that's intended for elderly people or people with accessibility issues. Really, in terms of the typologies and how we respond to the social housing situation, I think we're to an extent in Housing New Zealand's hands. But I know exactly what you're saying, and I think we need new typologies that as well as what we've been talking about here, that reflect the different communities and different cultures in our city. How we go about doing that, I don't know. As I was saying before, I don't know that that's something that the commercial sector will take on, to be honest. So it's probably in the hands of Housing New Zealand or other government-sponsored entities that to address that. But I think you've got a great point, and I'm sorry I don't have any answer, but I'd like to think that all the talented people in this room and all the rest of our profession can put our heads together and hopefully do something about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great subject for almost another session. We've been working with community housing providers. We're working with Tamaki, a development company, as well, at the stage where they would be working together with Housing New Zealand. And at that stage, the big debate was terraced houses or standalone detached houses. And there was the discussion shouldn't even be there at that stage. We know that we have to intensify. The density has to come. So it's not a question, of if we should do it. It's a question how quickly we can do it, and it's happening. There are houses, 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom houses. They're not big, but they still have 5 or 4 bedrooms. And I think there's a great stream of work to come in Waimahia, in Tamaki as well, and in all those areas. And yeah, we'd be really, really keen to be part of it. I think Council, Housing New Zealand, but also iwi will be playing a big role there as well. And just one thing I just recalled about parking is we've got car stackers in our office, and they're a pain, but yeah. But they do work, and they get almost twice the number of parks in our car park. So it's not, if we can't have the luxury, we have to be able to accept and make some compromises for the better good. Yeah.
I'll just add on just Tamaki Regeneration Company and sort of to your question. I think sometimes when we're talking about density, the argument or discussion gets a bit carried away. We are talking about, reasonable density in these apartment projects, but the reality at Tamaki is that Housing New Zealand had, and now the company has, a whole lot of sections that are more than 1,000 square metres with a small house in the middle, and what they're actually doing is to intensify is putting 3 dwellings on 1,000 square metres. But those 3 dwellings can be 3 family houses that can start to respond to the type of concerns that you're talking about, whether they be cultural or other issues. And still we can get 3 decent dwellings on there. They don't have to be apartment buildings. They can be 2-storey townhouses and be designed in a way that the communities can use them. So, with the work you guys are doing out there, when those properties have got 3 times the number of houses on them, that's a hell of a lot more houses, but it's still not density in the way that this is. So I think there's some untold stories out there that are happening, and they're good news stories.